Thanks, Andrew. Well, I start tonight with breaking news, exclusive news. Dr Jamal Rifi, one of Australia's highest profile Islamic community leaders, has hit out at Australian authorities, claiming that the Muslim community feel that this is a tale of two cities. Dr Jamal Rifi criticising the fact that the church stabbing was declared a terrorist event, but not the massacre in Bondi Junction. Dr Rifi is a highly respected doctor, but he strongly criticised New South Wales Police for announcing that this was a terrorist attack before, he says, they'd collected the teenager's mobile phone and other devices, before they'd interviewed the teenager or his family. I sat down with Dr Rifi for an exclusive interview just a moment ago. He was speaking on behalf of the family of the alleged terrorist who brutally stabbed a much-loved bishop. Dr Rifi told me that their son had moved schools 3 times as he dealt with anger and behavioural issues. He said that the teenager had seen multiple counsellors and was due to speak with a psychiatrist. He denied that there was any previous knife crime. Dr Jamal Rifi said the teenager's parents are in shock, and they claim their son was gentle but prone to anger outbursts. He said that the parents had seen no sign that their son had become radicalised. He said the parents didn't believe this was terrorism, and they're asking why police didn't wait to speak to their son. They claim he would never want to harm anyone. Now, that full exclusive interview coming up shortly. It is highly controversial. Many of you will strongly disagree with much of what Dr Jamal Rifi has to say. As I mentioned, he was speaking on behalf of the family of the alleged terrorist. This family have now gone into hiding as anger over the attack boils over in the Assyrian Christian community. Now, despite what the family of this teenager says, there are serious questions about why religious leaders failed to raise the radicalisation of an alleged terrorist with the authorities. And as I'll tell you in a minute, they were reportedly so concerned with his extremist views that they kicked the teenager out of their Islamic centres. And yet he wasn't on any terror watch list. Now, it comes as the investigation ramps up into how a Sydney public school student, who we've just learned had to move schools 3 times, could be radicalised to the extent that he felt comfortable brazenly launching a violent attack against a high-profile Christian bishop with live cameras streaming. Those who knew the teenager were worried that he spent too much time online watching radical content across social media, according to the Australian newspaper. The teenager had reportedly developed very hardline religious views that didn't comply with mainstream Islam. Alexei Dimitriadi and Liam Mendes report that a handful of popular Islamic centres around Greenacre had gone so far as to warn him to stay away, given he would not tone down his views and extreme remarks after directives from leaders and concerns raised by fellow young Muslims. Now, the media also widely reported on audio today where a man spoke about praying with the teenager and claimed that he'd been radicalised online. People who prayed with him said they immediately recognised him from the videos. This person in the audio said, sadly, that kid we prayed with today, these kids have been poisoned by a monster who has the radical Daesh mentality. This kid has been poisoned. So the accusation there that a teenager in Sydney, Australia, attending public schools was radicalised by Daesh or ISIS. It's bizarre that with this much concern, reportedly, about a suspected radicalised teenager, no one thought to raise his state of mind with the authorities. And the police have confirmed he wasn't on any terror watch list. Well, you have to ask, why wasn't he? And it's a question Ben Fordham raised today, saying we can't say that no one saw this coming when the teenager was allegedly, although the family deny it, carrying knives to school and on public transport. There were clear warning signs.
We have a kid who was known to police for carrying knives. He was let off and not punished. And we have a kid who was known to members of the Islamic community for having radical views. Now, did anyone call the police about him? That's what I want to know. There's a terrorism hotline that people can call if they have fears that someone's been radicalised. If it was good enough to kick him out of the prayer centre, did someone pick up the phone and warn the authorities? There's no suggestion they did.
Well, the Daily Telegraph reports that both state and federal police sources believe it's unlikely the teenager would have targeted Bishop Murray Emanuel of his own accord. And as Mark Murray told us last night, investigators are examining whether this alleged attacker was working with others before the attack.
The possibility that he'd done this on his own, I think, is remote, and the people I've spoken to seem to think the same thing. And like you said, we need to know the answers, and we need to know them as quickly as possible.
It's now been 2 days since the attack, but still no charges have been laid by police against the 16-year-old. He's said to be under police guard in hospital, his finger severed during the attack. Now, despite the denials from the boy's parents, authorities are examining whether he had any links with overseas terror networks. The alleged attacker has been described as a lone wolf actor, but former Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Defence Department, Peter Jennings, points out that often people don't develop extremist beliefs, if that's what's happened, in isolation. He says that in the case of Islamic State, it has a sophisticated online recruiting pipeline that looks for impressionable young people. Now, this boy's online history will show whether or not he was radicalised, whether he was watching ISIS videos or more current material. We will learn who he was interacting with, local or international figures, or none at all. But the bigger picture here is that many of us have been highly unimpressed with the leadership we are seeing after this terrorist attack, particularly from the Prime Minister. It's been very stark in the past 2 days, but this has been an ongoing issue of a lack of leadership from Anthony Albanese over the past 6 months. Compare it to how Tony Abbott led the country after the Lindt Cafe siege, or John Howard after the Port Arthur massacre, or after 9/11. When you look at their strong performances, inspiring confidence in the nation, there's no comparison. Have a look.
The events in Martin Place also show that we are ready to deal with these people professionally and with the full force of law.
We have to accept that this is an occasion where we should stand shoulder to shoulder with the Americans, because this is not just an assault on America, it's an assault on the way of life that we hold dear in common.
We are a peace-loving nation. This is a time to unite, not divide as a community and as a country.
Well, you can see by contrast, Albanese looked awkward, uncomfortable, unsure of himself, reading lines when he addressed the nation the night after the violent attack in a church, a place of worship. Now, part of the reason we're in this position now, where there's unprecedented social unrest in Australia, is because no one stood up strongly against the aggressive Opera House protests, because no one stood up strongly against the hate preachers. No one stood up to defend our Australian values. It's about time we had national leadership. Our country deserves it. And perhaps there also needs to be better relationships between the Muslim community leadership and police and ASIO. So when there is concern that a teen has become radicalised, they can let the authorities know to monitor the activity. And perhaps Albanese should also stop directing the national security establishment to examine climate change and instead allow them to only focus on threats to our nation like terrorism. And while he's at it, he could reinstate the intelligence chiefs as permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. All of this would strengthen the government's approach to national security. Now, that controversial interview with Dr Jamal Rifi, one of our most highest profile, the most respected Islamic community leaders in the country. That's coming up shortly. He's speaking on behalf of the family, but he also expresses the very strong view that this is a tale of two cities. Controversial interview coming up. Now, also tonight, we're going to look at Brittany Higgins' multi-million-dollar payout. It's under the microscope again as two former judges call for the compensation to be investigated by the Anti-Corruption Commission. Plus, the Iranian man at the centre of a High Court immigration challenge says he has a better chance of not being killed in Gaza than in Iran. And Australia hits another migration record, putting more pressure on the housing supply and on the government's promise to cut arrival numbers. But first, let's bring in our panel tonight. Joining me now, Victorian Liberal Party President, former Victorian Liberal Party President Michael Kroger, and former Labor Minister Graham Richardson. Welcome to you both. Look,
Sharri.
Great to see you. Look, we haven't played the interview just yet, but Michael, what I've just said, we've got one of the most senior Islamic leaders in the country. He's just done an exclusive interview with me just before I came on air tonight, and he's saying that the sentiment in southwest Sydney, the sentiment in the Muslim community is that the man, the attacker, the assailant in the Bondi Junction case has been treated differently to this teenager. He's saying in no uncertain terms that, you know, why is this called a terrorist attack and the other not? If this is the sentiment in the community, as he says, and he's a community leader, then the events of the past 3 days are going to lead to even more unrest than we're seeing already.
Indeed, I'm a very great admirer of Jamal Rifi, but I'm shocked by his comments. I mean, Sharri, what's happening in our country today? Social cohesion in Australia is disintegrating before our very eyes. And it's deteriorating under the leadership of Anthony Albanese, unfortunately. And weak press conferences saying things we all agree with, but taking no action and no one's listening to him, aren't good for this nation. He should have, as Prime Minister of this nation, called upon the Islamic leadership to sack the two hate preachers and give an undertaking that they would never again preach in a mosque in this country, given what they said about Jews, which was hate speech of the first order. That's leadership. That would have been an example to the whole country that this country does not put up with that type of behaviour. And of course, the other thing to make clear is this, Sharri. In a Western democracy like ours, you are allowed to criticise religion. You are allowed to criticise Muhammad without being stabbed. If you don't understand that, then you don't understand the Australian way of life.
And we saw the attack on the Charlie Hebdo team, the cartoonists, after they'd criticised Muhammad. I mean, if that's what's happened here, then it has echoes of that. Richo, we are hearing reports in the Australian, in the Daily Telegraph, that there were concerns from some Islamic centres that this teenager was becoming radicalised, that his views didn't align with mainstream Muslim views. But what do you think of the fact that this hadn't come to the attention of authorities from a terrorism perspective? Does there need to be better communication here?
Oh, there must be much better communication. The fact that this young man could develop in the way that he did and not be on the radar is pretty amazing. I'm staggered that we didn't know this fella, that we weren't watching him, that we weren't really taking a close aim at him to make sure that we knew everything about him, because these people, you know, they are so dangerous, and our way of life is so easygoing. We're not likely to ever notice it, you know. So we have to really work at this. We've got to work ourselves up a bit. We've got to get ourselves a bit more engaged, because if we don't, then I think we're going to see more attacks like that one. And just to be clear there, he'd come to the attention of police from a crime perspective, from those alleged previous knife incidents where he had a knife allegedly on public transport and at a school, but he hadn't come to the attention of authorities from a terror perspective, and they've made that very clear. He wasn't on any terror watch list. Just before we move on from this... But doesn't that strike you as strange? I mean, kids with knives at school aren't normal. You don't see them every day. And I just find it strange that that this wasn't passed up the line or around the corner or whatever it had to go. It just seemed to disappear, and that's just really dangerous.
Yeah. Well, just before we move on from this topic, there was the breaking news this evening that police have made the first arrest in relation to the riots that broke out following that stabbing attack. They've arrested a 19-year-old man. Michael Kroger, there are calls now yet again for the National Anti-Corruption Commission to investigate that multi-million-dollar payout that Brittany Higgins received. This in the wake of the verdict from Bruce Lerman's defamation trial. There was a story in The Australian today where two judges, former judges, said that it should be examined, the payout, because while Justice Michael Lee found that on the balance of probabilities she had been raped, he also found that there was no political cover-up.
When examined properly and without partiality, the cover-up allegation was objectively short on facts, but long on speculation and internal inconsistencies.
And that was Justice Michael Lee. Michael Kroger, what do you think?
So look, the problem for Brittany Higgins, and this has been we acknowledge this has been an extraordinarily traumatic period in her life that, no one would wish anyone to go through. But unfortunately, when she signed the settlement deed with the Commonwealth in December 2022, in Section 7 of that agreement, not only did she acknowledge that all the statements she was making were true and correct, which Justice Michael Lee pointed out there were at least 9 errors in that document, but she also warranted in Section 7 that she acknowledged that the Commonwealth were relying on these representations. In other words, the Commonwealth payment was made on the basis that everything she said in the deed was in the annexure to the deed, which was her record of events, was true. Well, clearly now there is, the court has said that a lot of those things that she warranted as true were not true. So that's another reason why this should be looked at, not from a corruption point of view, obviously from her point of view, but from the whole looking into the what happened. Now, as we know, the Commonwealth signed this deed after one day of hearings. The two ministers weren't invited to give their side of the story. That's the main problem with it. So yeah, will they be looking into it? I'm absolutely certain they'll be looking into it.
Richo, clearly the process needs to be looked at. You know, why the Commonwealth paid this so quickly, one-day mediation. They excluded Michaelia Cash and Linda Reynolds from participating in the process. They did that by refusing to give them legal aid or to pay for their lawyers. But, you know, where does this come down to? If the process is found to be improper, that's one thing. But should Brittany Higgins have to hand back the $1.9 million that she has personally pocketed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In my view, the amount in the first place was way over the top. And once you've made that decision, a bad decision, poor decision, then obviously from that consequences flow. And that's what we've seen over the course of the last few days. I really I sympathise greatly with her and with what she's been through, but that doesn't mean you simply open up the Treasury and say, here, take your lot. It doesn't work like that, and it shouldn't.
And then there's the question of Linda Reynolds, former Defence Minister. Clearly, Michael Kroger, she feels aggrieved. You know, she was defamed more broadly in the media. We all know that. She basically lost her job over this. A judge has now found that there was no cover-up, no improper political conduct. But do you think she should press on now with what's set to be a 6-week case against Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz, when we know that Brittany Higgins now, we know she was raped. She's probably still under a great deal of mental health stress, as she has been for the past 3 years. So again, this is a difficult question.
It's a difficult question, but what about Linda Reynolds? What about Fiona Brown? I mean, their careers were severely damaged. Brown didn't even want to give evidence because of the trauma that she would go through, as was the same for Brittany Higgins. But of course, Linda Reynolds has every right to proceed, and she should. I mean, the whole notion that there was some kind of cover-up in relation to this matter, everyone in the Liberal Party at the time knew that was all nonsense. But of course, in the maelstrom, you know, of the Me Too movement and what was happening at the time, the attacks on Scott Morrison, etc., Linda was collateral damage, and she's got every right to rectify her position, restore her reputation, as Brittany Higgins did in fighting or giving evidence against Lehman.
And it was her evidence that ultimately led to him making that outcome. So, she is the reason that that Ten and Lisa Wilkinson won that case, because ultimately Justice Michael Lee said that her description of Bruce Lehman being on top of her had the ring of truth. Now, just to another matter, the High Court has heard that an Iranian man who's demanding to be released from immigration detention would rather be sent to Gaza rather than back to Iran. This detainee is known only as ASF 17. He's refused to cooperate with deportation efforts because he says he would be persecuted in Tehran over his bisexuality. Richo, this is another very problematic case for the government.
It certainly is, because you can argue a pretty good case either way here. But I think there must be, in cases like this, more room for some compassion. And I wouldn't be making this fellow go back to a place where he would clearly be in danger.
Yeah. All right. Graham Richardson, Michael Kroger, thank you both so much for your time this evening. Now, after the break, fears of revenge attacks rise after a Western Sydney church attack. Mick Willing, the former New South Wales Deputy Police Commissioner, will join me next. Plus, my exclusive interview with Dr Jamal Rifi is coming up. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Well, more on the concerns of rising religious extremism following the alleged stabbing at a church in Sydney's southwest. Let's bring in now former New South Wales Deputy Police Commissioner Mick Willing. Mick, thank you so much for your time this evening. Look, there are reports of an audio message circulating after the attack which claims that the teenager's mind had been poisoned by a monster who has the radical Daesh mentality. Is this something that, from your former role as head of counter-terrorism, that the police will be focusing on now?
Oh, absolutely. I think integral to the investigation being conducted into what occurred at the church and the actions of the boy will be working out why. That's an obvious line of inquiry. So they'll be looking at all of his background, the information they can get from agencies, friends, people who knew the boy leading up to the attack, and trying to work out why it occurred. Now, obviously, if the boy has been encouraged in some form or another to commit the attack, that will be part of the investigation as well. And I need to clearly state that there are offences around enticing or encouraging acts of terrorism. So the investigation will take all of that into account, but it'll be a methodical one and it'll take some time, Sharri.
Yeah. So the Police Commissioner Karen Webb declared at 1:35 a.m. on Monday night. So the stabbing happened at around 7 a.m. 7 p.m, 7:10. So that same night, 1:35 in the morning, she declared this was a terrorist incident. What would have gone into her calculation before making that announcement?
Well, from experience, the Counter-terrorism and Special Tactics Command have well set and defined processes for identifying indicators that a particular incident is a terrorist incident or a set of circumstances may lead to a terrorism incident. So they form what's called a threat panel. They look at a range of those indicators and then engage with conversations with select executive members of the police force, obviously led by the Police Commissioner, and provide advice to the Commissioner, who ultimately has the power to make that decision. And on this occasion, I have no doubt that the information that went through that process and that the Commissioner considered was sufficient for her to declare this a terrorism incident. Obviously, as things progress through a court process, which will inevitably unfold, all of those issues will be examined by the court moving forward. But I think on this occasion it was the right decision given the circumstances that I think occurred leading up to that decision at 1:30 in the morning.
It's been reported that there are concerning text messages that are circulating which call on the Assyrian Christian community to launch revenge attacks on mosques. We know that there was a threat to Lakemba Mosque late on Monday evening. Police are so worried about all of these, concerns about reprisals that officers are being deployed to known Islamic locations. You look at our community at Sydney right now. communities on edge, different religious communities are all anxious and on edge. Have you seen social unrest like this?
Look, certainly after the incident that occurred over in Christchurch, there were similar feelings across different parts of the community. But this is on the back of the Bondi incident. Seems to be a particularly strange set of circumstances and troubling across the board. But Sharri, that the community of New South Wales and indeed Australia is a cohesive community. It does come together in times like this, and I think the leadership of the nation is calling for people to be calm, not take the law into their own hands, and reprisal attacks and the like certainly will do nothing to help this situation whatsoever. The actions that we saw of the mob, some estimates putting it at around 2,000 people the other night, were disgusting. Police and emergency services responding to an incident need to be allowed to do their job, and what we saw, yet again, brave actions of police and other emergency services, but those sorts of attacks, based on emotion and those acts of violence are simply not on in this country.
I mean, when you actually look at the figures in the light of day from Monday night, 43 police officers reportedly injured, some 50 police vehicles damaged in some way, 3 police officers actually had to be hospitalised. That situation got out of control very quickly.
Yeah, again, emotion sometimes drives actions which are, unexpected. But, the officers involved did a tremendous job from what I've seen and what I've been told. Brave actions by not only police officers, but ambulance service and other emergency services that attended there. But things can get out of hand very, very quickly. But luckily, in New South Wales, we have specialist resources within our police force that are trained to deal with those sort of situations, and they dealt with it, but it took time, of course, because these are very fluid and moving situations. But the violence against police was simply outrageous and, as I said, disgusting. And it's good to see the first arrest tonight, but I know that investigation is itself into the public order incident is a large investigation. Yet again, that's going to take time to get to the bottom of it all too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Mick Willing, thank you very much for your time this evening. Now, coming up after the break, the interview with Dr Jamal Rifi. We're also going to look at Australia, how it's hit another migration record, pressure mounting on the Albanese government to slash migration numbers, and the High Court legal challenge that could see up to 200 more detainees being released. That's after the break. Welcome back. The parents of the teenager accused of a terror attack at a Sydney church have broken their silence, and they claim that their son can't possibly be a terrorist. Islamic community leader Dr Jamal Rifi is acting as a spokesperson for the family, and he joined me just before the show to convey their messages to the public. Now, we've had to edit out some of this interview for legal reasons. Here is Dr Jamal Rifi. Dr Jamal Rifi, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Sharri, for hosting me.
Now, the parents of this alleged teenage terrorist have decided to speak to Australia through you as their spokesman. Have they seen the footage of Bishop Mari Emanuel being stabbed, and what do they say about it?
It was terrible. Yes, they have seen the footage, and they have seen the aftermath of the footage.
Do his parents think that he has been radicalised?
No, they don't. And the way they express it to me, he's always been a good guy. He's been religious, doing all his prayers, but they don't believe that he's been radicalized, because not long ago he bought himself a drum, and he was playing the drum, listening to the music, and swaying his body according to the music. For a radicalized person, this is a no-no. They wouldn't be listening to music. Now, I know that the whole of the community, they feel that we are living what we had during the pandemic, the tale of two cities. So a perpetrator in Bondi will be treated differently than a perpetrator in Fairfield. Except on a personal level, I understand that the police would be overwhelmed with the terrible event that took place in Bondi, and they needed to unlock extra powers to get the help from the ASIO and the AFP and the Commonwealth government. So there is, I understand, there is a difference between the two, but unfortunately, the overwhelming feeling in the community that it is, tales of two cities.
Dr Jamal Rifi, the authorities have been very clear, though. This isn't a case of a tale of two cities. In the one instance, absolutely horrific. 6 people killed. They're saying it was a man who had schizophrenia. There was no ideology behind it. There was no religious motivation, whereas they say in this instance, the teenager, the 16-year-old who allegedly brutally stabbed Bishop Mari Emanuel was religiously motivated. They say there was radicalisation there. So are his parents denying that there was any radicalisation? Have they examined his internet search history, for example, or do they know whether he had been watching content online that was extreme, or had he been visiting those so-called hate preachers?
So I would believe that if the timing was after the investigators have gone through all that and they made the decision, it will be more palatable. But right now, the quick and the speed. Now, yes, you might consider that it is not a tale of two cities, but at least the feeling in southwestern Sydney is a tale of two different citizens.
We hear there are reports in the Australian newspaper that there were concerns from Islamic centres that this teenager's views had allegedly become so hardline that he was asked not to return to those Islamic centres. Is this something that you or his parents are aware of?
To be honest, Sharri, there are a lot of opinion being put online. It doesn't mean they are true. We have seen when the Bondi event took place, someone else was named, and even initially, they said a person of Middle Eastern appearances, and later on, when the authority investigated and they found the first person that a first-year university student was labeled incorrectly. And right now, there are a lot of rumors out there, and I urge everyone to be patient, not to draw conclusion. We are talking about a boy who just turned 16. He knew, his family knew that he had a behavioral issues. They took him to 3 different psychologists, 2 female, 1 male. He has went through 3 different schools. He has been counseled all the time since year 7 or 8. And he had an appointment with a psychiatrist, but they couldn't make it because the psychiatrist himself has left Sydney. So I urge everyone to be calm, to wait. We're talking about the life of a 15 years old who just turned 16. And we talked about a family that is a humble family, ordinary citizen. They've done all what they could for their son.
So you just mentioned there that their son had moved schools 3 times. You said that he had behavioural issues. What sort of issues were they?
In the normal circumstances, he was described to me as a gentle person. He would actually refrain from lifting a cat of fear not to hurt the cat. But he's short-fused. He's got an anger management issue. He gets angry very easily. And there was a diagnosis that's actually put to them, but not confirmed by a practitioner of knowledge in this field.
Dr Jamal Rifi, did the parents say anything about the previous history of knife crime that we've seen alleged in the papers?
To be honest, it has been broadcast and in the paper and talked about in the wrong format. Her son never had a knife. He never been charged. The other boy that was with him had the knife, but not himself. As we all know, anyone who's under 18 years of age. It's illegal. And to carry a knife, her son was not charged because he did not carry the knife himself. He did not have a knife on him.
All right, Dr. Jamal Rifi, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sharri. And look, it's been a horrible week for us, for the whole community. It's not.
Now, Dr. Jamal Rifi is a respected doctor and community leader, but let's be very clear. This isn't a case of two citizens. It's not a case of two cities. The Bondi Junction and the Wakeley Church are not the same. One was a known schizophrenic who was not motivated by religion or ideology, according to the police, whereas the teenager is said to have been radicalised. And the New South Wales Police, ASIO, the federal government have all declared that this is a terror attack because it was religiously motivated. Now, as I mentioned, we had to edit out parts of that interview for legal reasons. That's why there were edits in it, for legal reasons. But Dr. Rifi there conveying the family's views that they don't believe this was terrorism, they can't believe their son had been radicalised. But the allegation so far is that right after the alleged attack on the bishop, he made a comment about the bishop having insulted his religion, and the Australian newspaper has reported that Islamic centres described him as having hardline views. Now, let's move on. The Albanese government is anxiously awaiting the decision of the High Court, which is considering a landmark legal challenge from a detained Iranian immigrant. Let's bring in now our Wednesday political panel. Labor MP Daniel Molino and National Senate leader Bridget McKenzie. Welcome to you both. Daniel, this Iranian man claims he'd rather go to Gaza rather than go back to Iran. He says he's bisexual and he would be killed in Iran. But depending on the outcome, could we see another 200 detainees on our streets?
Well, thanks for having me on, Sharri. Good to see you, and hi, Bridget. Look, this is a situation where we don't know what the decision of the High Court is, and it's very hard to speculate about all the various contours that decision could take. Clearly, the decision could go in a number of ways, but the government is arguing that this man not be released. And what we've done in anticipation of this court case is to put laws in front of the Parliament in the last sitting week to provide additional options to the government and to ministers to provide us with extra levers. So we'll see that decision in the next few days. We'll then have to take a bit of time to analyse the precise reasons, and that will give us a much better understanding of exactly what the repercussions of that decision will be. Clearly, whatever the decision is, the Australian government is going to have to abide by it. But we will also, in addition to pursuing the arguments in that court case, bring those laws that we had in the last sitting week back to the Parliament when it resumes in a few weeks' time.
Bridget McKenzie, do you want to jump in there? The High Court hearing this challenge today.
I am.
Yep. Go for it.
Yep, I am. This gentleman's had 10 years to prove that he's a refugee. He's been unable to do that. My understanding is today was the first hearing in a case that could actually take months. And Daniel, if past behaviour is any predictor of future behaviour, it would seem your ministers will refuse to listen to briefings from departmental officials, won't make decisions in the national interest, and indeed will set this case on unfound footing because they actually won't be taking departmental advice, which is exactly what happened last time. We were given warm comfort words that we needed to have comfort and confidence in the system and the minister, and we still don't know how many from that previous muck-up, how many detainees are actually on the streets, how many have ankle bracelets on and the right and are being monitored appropriately. So I have no confidence in this government's preparation for the case if the two ministers who are in charge of the last one are still the two ministers in charge of handling this case.
Yeah. Look, also pressure when it comes to housing supply and immigration. We're hearing that the number of net permanent and long-term arrivals has reached more than 100,000 a month. Increasing pressure on this topic for the Albanese government. Daniel, Claire O'Neill had said previously that she was going to lower the migration targets. Where is this up to, and is this going to happen?
Yes, look, I'd just take a step back on this one and say that Australia's come out of a period where we had 2 years of zero migration. And if you look at the decade or two before that, we were a very high migration OECD country. And I think during that period that served us well by and large. Now, we very much supported the previous government's measures to close the border for the sake of the safety of our country. I think that was the right call. But what it meant is that when we came out of COVID, we had incredible labour shortages right across the board. And so migration numbers were always going to increase from zero to a number that was at least temporarily above trend. And we saw that. Now, it got to the point where it was higher than I think than the economy could cope with, and so the government has put in place measures to bring it back down to a level that is more sustainable. We've already seen some success in relation to university students, for example. Integrity measures in that space have reduced numbers by something in the order of 35,000 people. Now, I think some of the increase in this last month reflects the fact that there are pipeline issues. There are probably a whole bunch of approvals in the pipeline that are seeing their way through into the country. But my understanding is that based upon the numbers we're seeing, we're still on track to see a halving of overall net migration intake by the middle of next year. But it's not the kind of thing you just turn off in one day. It does take a little bit of time to come through because there's a whole bunch of approvals.
Let's bring in Bridget on this. I mean, Daniel ultimately saying there that it was balancing out the years during COVID where there weren't many or any migrants coming here. But hasn't Labor gone even higher than just making up for the lack of migrants during the COVID period?
Yeah, absolutely, Sharri. Look, I've been in Brisbane at an Olympics hearing all day about Labor's failure of infrastructure rollouts for that particular event, and this is an absolute gold medal winning performance by the Labor Party. They've got 100,000 new arrivals this month. Largest number of arrivals in our country's history. Meanwhile, congested city streets and suburbs, particularly Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, and they're cutting the infrastructure that's needed to actually accommodate these migrants at the same time. This is happening whilst we've also got the lowest housing starts for over a decade. So I think, Daniel, mate, you don't cut migration by having a record high month this month. It's not on track. If it was on track, it would be going down, not up. That's kind of just a fundamental mathematic fact. The fact is Labor doesn't take this seriously. They haven't been able to take our border issues seriously, whether it's boat arrivals, whether it's handling detainees, or indeed a regular migration program where we're not getting this type of skilled migrants we actually need. We don't get the construction workers and the electricians, the mechanics, etc., that we need to keep our economy going. And the only thing stopping this country going into recession is population growth through migration. So, Daniel, I'm sorry, the talking points say what they say, but you've been sold a pup on this one.
In my opinion, one of the things that is most notable about this is that it wasn't an election policy. Labor never went to the election and said, we're going to have a big Australia, or we're going to have a high migration intake, to even if it was to balance out the lack of migrants under the COVID period. Anyway, Daniel Molino, Bridget McKenzie, thank you both so much for joining me. Now, after the break, Israel urges Australia to take a tougher stance on Iran as the fallout over the attack on the weekend continues. Israel now looking to retaliate. We're expecting this imminent. An expert will join me next. Well, in the aftermath of Iran's missile and drone attack against Israel over the weekend, there is one thing that is abundantly clear: that Joe Biden is no deterrent for Tehran's terrorism. He's basically asleep at the wheel. He's only emboldened Iran. I'm joined now by senior lecturer at the Curtin University Law School and Sky News contributor, Rocco Lossono. Rocco, thank you very much for joining me. Look, Joe Biden has been weak and weak on Israel over the past few months. We then saw this direct attack from Iran, which is unprecedented. Usually they use proxies. What does this tell you about America's leadership in the Middle East and globally?
Well, good evening, Sharri. Yes, look, the Biden administration has been talking tough. We had a speech with Antony Blinken in June last year saying that through diplomacy and deterrence we can hold Iran at bay because we know that they actively support terrorists. But the fact of the matter is that even after October 7, the US did not enforce oil sanctions against Iran, which means it was able to export 1.4 billion barrels of oil a day. And of course, all that money goes to finance terrorists. Weakness invites aggression. It's a bit like the schoolyard. If you want to stop bullies, you've got to stand up to them. And over the last 18 months or so, America has not been standing up to Iran, and we've seen the consequences of that since October.
Well, Joe Biden is so inarticulate that whenever he's been asked in interviews what does he have to say to Tehran, which has been weighing up whether or not to attack Israel since October 7, directly attack it, all he can say is don't. That's it. Don't. One word. I mean, is this the reality of what we're looking at here? That the Ayatollahs don't think that US is ultimately going to come to Israel's defence?
Well, look, I mean, just a one-word reply: don't. And it's not just Joe Biden. I think the West collectively has a sense of moral fatigue and a moral abandonment, and we're seeing it in our leadership here in Australia with our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister. And I think this is born of an ignorance of history. I mean, don't they realise that in the whole history of the Middle East conflict, one side has been prepared to compromise, while the other side, it's always been all or nothing. There's one side that wants to wipe Israel off the map. And once they wipe Israel off the map, they're coming for the rest of us. And that is a stated aim. I mean, Bob Hawke said that when the bell tolls for Israel, it will toll for all mankind.
As Bob Hawke said when he was Prime Minister, unlike Albanese. Now, Israel is reportedly considering retaliation. It's said to be imminent. It could be the next couple of days. That's what we're all expecting. The US and the international community have said to Israel, don't retaliate. I had Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie here on the show last night. He said you can't respond to Iran with weakness. He says Israel does need to take strong action. What's your view?
Well, at the end of the day, Sharri, Israel has a right to defend itself against these attacks. And I think we're failing here in the West because we've had the luxury of peace for about 80 years. Since the Second World War, we haven't had a conflict where we have had to fight for our very existence. Israel is fighting for its very existence, and it must take whatever means possible to do so.
Yeah. Do you think that the Australian government here, the Albanese government, has been strong enough in support of Israel, or do you think that there was that initial support right after the terror attacks and it's just been kind of weakness ever since?
Well, again, initially, yes, there might have been some strong words, but with Penny Wong's statement last week, they seem to be trying to appease these clueless activists on the extreme left of the Labor Party who've always been anti-Israel and therefore anti-West. Israel at the moment seems to be the whipping boy for the general attacks on Western civilisation.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, if you missed my exclusive interview with Dr Jamal Rifi, head to the Sky News website. He said that this alleged terrorist is just a teenager. He said he's just 16 years old, and he claims this is a tale of two cities. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at 8, and here's Paul Murray.